Hey everybody, it's Mr. Matthew here again for our MCAS Ecosystems video number 2. And in this video, we're going to talk about how biotic and abiotic factors affect biodiversity. So first we'll take a minute and we'll sort of define what biodiversity means, both globally and locally. And then we'll look at each of those two. First we'll look at biotic factors, and then we'll look at abiotic factors and how those things can affect the biodiversity of a given ecosystem. So here we go. So first off, what is biodiversity? Biodiversity is generally referred to as the variety and variability of life on Earth, and this can mean the genetic variability, the species variability, or even the ecosystem variability. And so this first map shows us what are known as the biodiversity hotspots. So what you'll see is those orange regions, yellow regions. So any of those things that have the coloration along the bottom, you're going to see increases in biodiversity being documented. We'll see that really high in places like tropical rainforests or just other areas where there's a lot of wildlife that is being documented. Now around here, biodiversity is going to look a little different. We are not a biodiversity hotspot, but that does not mean that we do not have a great deal of biodiversity. So over on the lower left, I have an image of waterfowl, and that is in a local ecosystem around this area around the turn of the 19th century. And next to it, I have a picture from Boxborough, and you see all those purple flowers. Those are invasive purple loosestrife flowers that have been introduced into the ecosystem, and they're actually choking out a lot of the diversity. When we do walks around on our nature trail, particularly in the very, very end of the school year or very beginning, we can actually see some purple loosestrife even cropping in on campus and choking out some of the native wetland plants that we see. And then up in the upper right, we have the state bird of Massachusetts, the black-capped chickadee feeding at a feeder, and then this squirrel that were up there. So just because we don't necessarily have the same numbers of ecosystems or the amount of variability that you see in a tropical rainforest doesn't mean that we do not have biodiversity. And then even within the populations that we have, there can be great genetic diversity there. So a couple important things to note about biodiversity before we get into the specific ways biotic and abiotic factors will influence them. So here is a map of New England plus New York and New Jersey. And what this is showing is the number of deer per square mile. So why am I talking about this? Well, deer are an animal, and they're going to have an impact on the other types of wildlife that you're going to find. So anybody who's ever had deer in their yards will know that they eat the local landscaping. And we also know that there's really not a lot of hunters that are in the wild for deer. Now, we do have humans that go out and hunt deer, but what you'll notice here about this map is the regions that have the greater densities tend to be areas where you may not necessarily have a lot of hunting, and the areas that have the lowest density are actually the regions where you're more likely to have hunting. So for example, in upstate New York or in Western Massachusetts or in upstate New Hampshire or Vermont, you're more likely to have hunters in those regions than say in an area like Boston or an area down along the Connecticut line, down in the New York City, Stamford, Greenwich area. And so what we'll find is that in areas where there's abundant wildlife or abundant greenery for the deer to eat, you will see abundant deer, and you have no natural predators, no hunters, and we don't see them being reduced in numbers by any natural predators. Now, when we look at what happened to deer population in the U.S., if you go back to 1450, pre-colonial times, it's estimated that there were, and I think these are in millions, it's estimated that there were 45 million different types of deer in there, and 30 million of those would have been white-tailed deer, which are the predominant deer type that we have around here. And so what we'll see here is that over the first 450 years of North America settlement by Europeans, we saw a plummeting of both whitetail and mule, blacktail, and other types of deer down to really almost nothing. And then during the 20th century, we saw an increase in deer population, most notably white-tailed deer, and a slight comeback of some of the other types of deer population. So my question for you now is I'd like you to pause and think. If white-tailed deer populations increase, what other populations might increase? I want you to pause and think. All right, so hopefully what you were thinking is, well, when those white-tailed deer populations sunk down, it probably also corresponded with a loss of some natural predators. And those natural predators might have been things like wolves and coyotes. And as you see a rise in white-tailed deer, you would expect to have a slight increase of those wild predators. Now, we haven't seen them quite come back in this area, but there are parts of the country where wolves and other natural predators to deer have been on the rise. The other thing that you might have thought about are things that might be consumers of deer, but maybe not macro scale. So what about things like ticks? So the deer tick, most notably, is a parasite that will land on deer and will feed on its blood. And it has a life cycle that would include the deer and also some mice, and would also include possibly humans or other domesticated organisms like dogs or cats. And so what we can see here is that as we see this increase in white-tailed deer, you might see some of the parasites like ticks that are associated with them would also increase. Now, you might see certain types of vegetation, wildflowers, and that sort of thing might be on the decrease in certain areas as a side note of them. But there's sort of an interesting thing to think about is as one major organism changes, and those organisms are biotic factors, how will it influence the diversity of the ecosystem? Will it cause the rise of certain species? Will it cause the fall of certain species? And that's what we really mean when we talk about biotic factors that influence biodiversity. All right, so what about abiotic factors? And so when we talk about abiotic factors, we could talk about a lot of different things. Over here on the top left, I have the measurement of CO2 in the atmosphere. And obviously, this is our hockey stick graph that we've talked about before. And we see it having a spike. In the middle, we have land and ocean temperatures. Temperature is another abiotic factor. We see that on the increase. And then over on the far right, we have sea level rise, and it's another water level rising, particularly sea level rising. And we see the rate of change based off of the slope of that graph. And we see sea level rise increasing as well. So all three of these are good examples of abiotic factors. So these are all mathematical representations. These are graphs. They demonstrate averages. They show trends. These are really good data sets. So now what would the impact be on the ecosystems? Now, what I'm about to show you is aerial maps of Cape Cod starting in 1984 and extending up to 2013. And what I want you to do is take a minute and observe what happens to North Beach between 1984 and now. So what has happened over those last 30 years? And could this be a shift in either sea level rise or some other coastal factors such as wind and water erosion that have led to some changes in the shape of this ecosystem, specifically focusing on North Beach, as a result of the shift of the abiotic factors? And so what you see here is North Beach being broken up and slightly modified over this time. It goes from a really large, long extension down into two breaks. And then ultimately, by the time we get to 2013, we're at 3 separate junctions, possibly even 4 of that once long extended sea breaker that we had sticking out in the ocean. So this is a good example of how abiotic factors are shaping the structure of the ecosystem over time. Now we could focus in on some other aspects of here, some of the other water levels in some of the inlets, but those are a little harder and more nuanced. And we probably need a little better imaging there. But I thought this was a good visual of how we could have abiotic factors changing what we see in terms of the shape of the ecosystem. So what this might mean is that if you change the shape of this ecosystem, what that will mean is you're also going to end up changing what organisms will be able to live there. You could envision that possibly seabird populations and nesting populations might be broken up by taking the single landmass and breaking it down into 4 separate masses. You might be stopping gene flow from going from one location to another. You're now also opening up different locations where certain aquatic creatures may be able to move where they weren't able to move before. So you might actually be introducing new species into inlet areas that weren't able to get there as readily as before because of the breakup of this North Beach. This changing of these abiotic factors is now going to allow biotic factors, namely the different types of species and the flow of genes from those species, to interact in a brand new way because of these shifts. All right, so hopefully now you can use mathematical representations to support an explanation that biotic and abiotic factors affect the biodiversity, including genetic diversity within a population and species diversity within an ecosystem. So you should be able to talk both about feeding relationships, you should be able to talk about symbioses, you should be able to talk about competition, and you should also be able to talk about disease. I didn't go into a lot of those in specifics in this video, but they were highlighted in video number 1 greatly. So hopefully you could apply what we learned from video 1 into these changing biotic and abiotic factors and how they shape the ecosystem. Also, you should be able to look at how abiotic factors could include climate and weather conditions, natural disasters, and availability of resources. Again, we focused mostly on climate, a little bit on weather, and not necessarily about the natural disasters and availability of resources, but hopefully you can extrapolate from what we learned in video 1. And then again, hopefully you could look at a graph and determine a trend and see how that trend, particularly one using multiple data sets, might tell us a larger story. And we looked at both that for the various deer populations and for those abiotic factors. So I hope that was helpful, and I'll talk to you all soon.